What happens when a promise, spoken like a prayer, becomes the catalyst for a reckoning that no one sees coming? On the frosty Christmas Eve of 1857, in the heart of Carolina's Low Country, a woman named Elara would provide the answer. She was a keeper of secrets at the Willow Creek Estate, a place known for its sprawling oaks and the casual cruelty of the four Beaumont brothers who ruled it. Armed not with a weapon, but with a memory that refused to fade, she was about to turn their world of absolute power into a silent, lasting legacy of consequence. Elara, only 28, had been born and raised within the suffocating elegance of the estate, taught to serve with a lowered gaze and a silent tongue, to absorb unfairness like the ground absorbs rain. But on that holy night, as the world celebrated peace, Elara would not serve. She would not remain silent. She would seek balance. With a resolve as cold and sharp as the winter air, she would bring a final, undeniable accountability to Arthur, Julian, Elias, and Marcus Beaumont. 4 brothers, 4 masters of their domain, 4 men who believed their world was unbreakable. What began as their most opulent Christmas dinner, filled with boastful laughter and expensive wine, would soon become a quiet storm of broken promises and overdue justice. In the span of a few short hours, the Beaumont line would be forever altered, not by madness, but by a love betrayed and a future stolen. This is the story of Elara and a man named Samuel Vance, whose memory sparked a fire that not even the coldest winter night could extinguish. While Charleston shimmered with candlelight, the servant quarters at Willow Creek shivered in the shadows. The moon hung overhead, a pale, swollen eye in the dark, too weary to witness another night of the same quiet suffering. Across the county, grand houses glowed with warmth. Children slept soundly, dreaming of morning gifts, while the scent of roasted turkey and spiced ham filled the air. It was a night for hymns, for family, for peace. But at Willow Creek, the air was different. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the floorboards of the quarters. There was no fire here, only the sound of weary coughs and the whistle of wind under the doors. Elara sat near the embers, her posture straight, her hands still. To anyone else she looked as she always did, composed, patient, waiting. But her eyes were fixed on the flames, not the fire, but a face, Samuel's face. His laugh, which once echoed bright and clear behind the smokehouse, now felt like a distant drumbeat, a rhythm only she could hear. His last words to her were a promise, "Wait for me." But he never returned. He had been sent 2 counties west, to a place run by a man with no patience and a reputation for breaking spirits. Samuel tried to find his way back within the first week. They made an example of him. When the news finally drifted back to Willow Creek, a cold, clipped report of his fate, Elara did not shed a tear. She served dinner. She polished the silver. She pressed the Beaumont brothers' fine coats. And in that silence, a part of her turned to stone. Earlier that evening, she had been splitting firewood behind the main kitchen. The axe handle was smooth and worn, familiar to her grip after years of use. She tested its weight, the balance of it in her hands. Swing, breathe, listen. She wasn't thinking about the fire. Inside the grand house, the Beaumonts were celebrating their prosperity. 4 men, all bearing the same arrogant confidence. Arthur, the eldest, fancied himself a scholar, quoting philosophers while approving transactions that tore families apart. Julian, the second son, was a man of quiet vices whose charm was a mask for his cruel intentions, particularly toward the youngest and most vulnerable servants. Elias, the third, was a man of supposed faith, leading prayers on Sunday before overseeing harsh disciplines on Monday. And Marcus, the youngest, was a vessel of pure temper, a man who once struck a horse for stumbling, his rage a constant, simmering threat. Tonight they drank and sang, oblivious. Elara had served them herself, her movements a perfect ballet of practiced obedience. She had bowed, nodded, smiled faintly, but all the while she was counting. 1 bottle of brandy, then 2. They were becoming careless, just as she needed them to be. Back in the quarters, an old man named Joseph watched her. "You are quiet tonight, child," he murmured. Elara didn't turn. "Quiet doesn't mean empty," she replied, her voice even. He grunted. "Christmas Eve is no night for restless spirits." She finally met his gaze. "That's why they walk." The wind pressed against the door, as if trying to hear. Tucked away behind a stack of kindling near the smokehouse was the tool she had just been holding. Clean, heavy, waiting. The world would later try to name what happened next. They would call it a tragedy, an outrage. But on this night, for Elara, it was simply the balancing of a scale. While the rest of the world sang of a birth in a manger, she was preparing for a different kind of arrival, the arrival of a woman who had finally decided to answer for the dead. Before the cold resolve in her hands, before the steel beneath her silence, there had been a promise. It was small and soft, but it was everything. Elara remembered the day Samuel Vance arrived at Willow Creek. He walked with his shoulders back, a posture so rare among men who had been taught to bend. His eyes were sharp, not with defiance, but with an unbroken spirit. He possessed a quiet dignity that seemed to make others stand a little taller in his presence. He hadn't been born into this life, not completely. His mother had known freedom, until a legal document, a cruel piece of paper, had turned her liberty into a lie and her bloodline into property. At first, Samuel worked the fields without a word of complaint. Soon his skill with horses was noticed. The overseer began to speak to him with a fraction less venom, not from kindness, but from a recognition of his value. And before long, Samuel was meeting Elara in the deep shadows behind the smokehouse, where only the stars could bear witness to their conversations. He spoke of a place called Ohio, of crisp, clean air and mornings that belonged only to you. He told her he would find a way, save enough to secure their freedom. Elara rarely spoke. She listened, but every time his hand found hers in the darkness, a hope she had long buried would flutter, a fragile thing against the bars of its cage. One evening, Arthur Beaumont summoned Elara to his study. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of cherry tobacco. He poured a glass of port, studying her with the same detached assessment he used when inspecting his livestock. "I've seen how you and the horsebreaker look at each other," he said, swirling the dark liquid. Elara remained silent. "You desire a future? Continue your diligent work through the holidays. Keep your head down. Ensure this house is perfect for our guests. And when spring arrives," he paused, a thin smile playing on his lips, "perhaps I'll be inclined to draw up the papers." He never mentioned Samuel by name, but the implication was clear. A future, not just for her, but for them both. That night, Elara didn't tell Samuel what had been said. She simply held him, her forehead pressed against his chest, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in the life beyond this one. She let herself dream. 2 weeks later, Samuel was gone. Sent away overnight. No warning. No goodbye. Elara learned the truth from one of the older field hands, who had overheard Julian Beaumont bragging about the deal. He said they'd gotten a fine price for a strong-willed asset. He'd laughed when he said it. The next morning, Elara went to Arthur,
her face a mask of calm, her voice a low murmur. "You said spring," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Arthur looked up from his morning paper, annoyed by the interruption. "He was not part of the arrangement," he said coldly. She held his gaze for a moment longer. "And me?" He smirked, a cruel, self-satisfied expression. "Spring is still a long way off. Be a good girl, Elara." She gave a slight nod, turned, and left the room without another word. But as she passed the grand fireplace in the main hall, her fingers grazed the handle of a heavy iron poker resting on its stand. She let her hand rest there for just a second, feeling the cold, unyielding weight of it. It was just enough. Days turned into weeks. Then the rest of the story arrived, carried on the wind like a bitter chill. Samuel had tried to appeal for his freedom, citing the promise made to him. At his new location, this was seen not as a plea, but as an act of defiance. There had been a confrontation, an unfortunate incident, the story went. He had been seriously injured and left to the elements. The news was delivered without emotion, a simple report of a lost investment. No one spoke of it directly to Elara, but they didn't have to. The way she moved through the house afterward was different. She folded the linens with a slow, deliberate precision, each crease sharp and perfect, as if she were wrapping something sacred. She didn't weep. She didn't raise her voice. But the next time she polished the Beaumonts' riding boots, she noted the scuffs and patterns of their wear. She memorized the distinct sound of each brother's footsteps on the grand staircase, the specific creak of the third step outside their rooms. She began to rise before the sun and go to bed long after the last candle was extinguished. Her work became flawless, impeccable. To the brothers, she was more efficient than ever. No one noticed that the firewood was being chopped with a cleaner, more rhythmic strike. No one noticed that the axe was being cleaned and stored with unusual care. No one noticed that her gaze no longer fell to the floor when they passed. The promise had been a lie, but in its place, something else had taken root. It was colder, older, and far more patient, like the frost that waits beneath the soil for its moment to claim the land. Samuel was gone, but Elara was still here, watching, waiting. The axe was just a tool, heavy and worn, smoothed by years of calloused hands. She had held it through 7 long winters, splitting the logs that warmed the food of men who thrived on her silence. But on the morning of Christmas Eve, as a thin layer of frost coated the dead grass, she lifted it, as if it were an extension of her own arm. She tested its balance, swung it low once, and listened. The sound it made in the crisp air was not the dull thud of a daily chore. It was the whisper of a coming reckoning. The yard behind the kitchen was still. The other staff were busy inside, their movements dictated by the demands of the holiday feast. The frost had not yet surrendered to the morning sun, and each of her breaths was a fleeting ghost in the air. Elara stood alone. She swung again. A thick log split perfectly down the middle. It was a clean, efficient motion, devoid of any wasted energy. To any observer, it would have been ordinary, but there was a new stillness in her posture between each swing, a profound focus. It was as if she wasn't just cutting wood. She was listening to it, remembering. Each blow of the axe was a beat in a silent internal rhythm, one for every lie she had been told, one for every hope Samuel had carried, one for each of the 4 men who believed this day was theirs to celebrate. Later that morning, she returned to the house, her apron spotless, her hands folded before her. To the Beaumonts, she was invisible, a part of the house itself. Arthur sat in the parlor, reviewing his accounts. Elias was at the piano, humming a hymn between sips of whiskey. Julian watched the younger housemaids with a predatory stillness, and Marcus, the youngest, had not yet come downstairs. Elara moved between them like a phantom. She placed fresh logs beside the hearth. She lit candles. She dusted the heavy gold frame of the portrait of their father, a man whose legacy was written in ledgers and land deeds, all built on the backs of others. The brothers were his living monuments, molded in his cruel image, saturated with an arrogance that made them blind. None of them saw her hand linger on the mantel. None of them saw her eyes flick to the large ring of keys hanging near the back entrance. At midday, she slipped back to the quarters, not for rest, but to gather items no one would ever miss. A strip of oiled cloth to silence a squeaking hinge, a spare apron to wrap the axe head, and a worn shawl that smelled of wood smoke. She concealed everything behind a stack of crates near the smokehouse, confident it would remain untouched. She walked slowly, with purpose, not because she feared being seen, but because she wanted to commit every detail of these final moments to memory. Every breath, every beat of her heart before its rhythm changed for good. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Elara watched the brothers gather in the great room. They laughed, their voices booming, and drank brandy warmed by the fire. The scent of roasted duck and pine filled the house. A trio of musicians, borrowed from a neighboring estate, played softly in a corner. They celebrated because they believed they were untouchable, because their world had never shown them anything to the contrary. But another presence filled the room that night. Not just music, not just smoke. It was memory, thick, bitter, and rising. The axe remembered, and so did she. Soon the walls would bear witness to a final truth. Elara moved through the celebration with quiet grace, and with every step, the weight of the wrapped axe hidden near the smokehouse seemed to pull the future closer. It was no longer a simple tool. It was the name of a debt she had not yet spoken aloud. But soon, the axe would speak for her.
She had not prayed since Samuel was taken. The last time she'd closed her eyes and whispered a plea to the heavens, the world had answered with deafening silence. What she did now, sitting on a low stool in the back pantry, was not prayer. It was a recitation, a quiet accounting of names and faces, spoken not to the sky, but to the deepest part of herself. Sarah, Samuel, Mama, Binta, Moses, Hector, Grace. One name for each step she would have to take through that house. One name for each debt that needed to be paid. Each name was a weight, a drumbeat in her chest. In this moment, she was not alone. They were all with her. Elara rose from the stool, the kitchen clock ticking softly behind her. The other servants were either asleep in their quarters or had found quiet corners to rest, too exhausted to stir. No one would question her movements. She had become perfectly invisible. She moved through the servant halls, her soft shoes making no sound on the worn floorboards. Every candle she passed seemed to flicker, its light dancing as if in recognition. Outside, she reached into the hidden space she had prepared behind the barrels. Her hands found the cloth bundle. She unwrapped it. The axe head gleamed in the faint moonlight, not with polish, but with a sharp, honed edge that spoke of purpose. She tested its weight one last time. Her arms felt strong, steady. They remembered, and so did the axe. Inside the great house, the brothers had finally separated. Arthur had retreated to his study with his ledgers. Julian had followed a young housemaid upstairs, his intentions a venomous secret everyone knew, but no one dared name. Elias had passed out in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, a half-empty glass of wine still in his hand. And Marcus, restless and agitated, was pacing the main hall, his temper soured by the amount of brandy he had consumed. They were scattered. It was just as she had planned. Not with ink on paper, but in the silent, meticulous corners of her mind where her resolve now lived. She took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine, wax, and old smoke. She stepped into the back hallway. The floorboard under the rug creaked once, a familiar sound, and then held. She tightened the grip on the handle. From this moment on, there would be no hesitation, no second thoughts, only the axe and the names. The study smelled of pipe smoke and leather, the scent of decisions that sealed fates in quiet, comfortable rooms. Arthur sat at his desk, just as she knew he would be. The plantation accounts were spread before him under the soft glow of an oil lamp. He read with his boots propped up, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the arm of his chair. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face, giving him a false appearance of peace. Elara stood in the doorway, a shadow in the darkness. She held the axe low, still wrapped in a cloth. She did not pause. She had already walked this path 1,000 times in her mind until it no longer felt like a choice, but a destination. She took a step into the room. He didn't look up. Another step. He heard her then and glanced over, his eyes unfocused from drink and fatigue. "Elara," he asked, his voice thick, "is the fire dying?" She said nothing. She only watched him. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He began to rise from his chair, a question forming on his lips. And that is when she moved. One swift, silent stride, both hands on the axe. It rose and fell in a single, fluid arc. There was a dull, final sound, like a heavy log splitting. The body slumped back into the chair. The brandy glass tipped over and shattered on the floor. Dark liquid pooled across the ledgers, the ink of his profits bleeding into a deep, final red. She did not look away. She took one step back, watching for any sign of movement. There was none. No more orders, no more promises, no more lies. She reached over and turned down the lamp's wick, plunging the room into near darkness. Then she closed the door behind her gently, as if leaving a man to his sleep. She moved back into the hall, her breath steady. 1 debt settled, 3 remained.
She passed the parlor where Elias still slept, the Bible resting on his chest. Not yet. She needed him to see. She needed him to understand. Upstairs, she heard a faint sound from behind Julian's door. A muffled whimper. That was next. But first, the girl. Elara climbed the stairs, her feet sure on each step. She had memorized every creak, every groan of the old wood. At the top of the landing, she paused. The hallway was a long corridor of shadows. Behind the third door, she heard Julian's voice, low and coaxing, followed by a sudden silence. She tightened her jaw. She reached for the doorknob, but then stopped. Instead, she knocked. The sound was soft, almost polite. Inside, there was a shuffle, the sound of hurried movement. "What is it?" Julian's voice was sharp with irritation. She knocked again, a little louder this time. She heard him curse, then the sound of his heavy footsteps. The door creaked open, and his face appeared in the sliver of light from the hall.
His shirt was unbuttoned, his eyes filled with a cruel amusement that died the moment he saw her. "Elara," he hissed. "What is the meaning of this?" She didn't answer. She simply stepped forward and swung. The blow was not aimed at his head. It was aimed at the door, crashing it inward and sending him staggering back. He screamed, a sound of shock and pain, tripping over a rug as he scrambled away from her. Elara followed him into the room. Her second motion was not a swing, but a powerful shove that sent him collapsing into a heavy oak wardrobe. The third and final action was swift, and then he was silent. In the far corner of the room, a young girl huddled under a blanket, her eyes wide with terror. Elara lowered the axe, her chest heaving. Blood was on her apron now. She turned to the girl and took a step closer. The girl flinched. Elara knelt, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." She reached out a hand, slowly. "Go to the cookhouse. Auntie May is there. Lock the door and do not open it for anyone." The girl stared for a second, then nodded and fled from the room, her bare feet silent on the stairs. Elara stood, her legs feeling heavy. 2 down. Back in the hall, the axe dripped. She heard a noise from downstairs. She turned just in time to see Elias stumbling out of the parlor, blinking in the dim light. He saw the trail on the floor, then looked up the stairs and saw her. He froze. "Elara, what is all this? Where is Julian?" he slurred, confused. She said nothing. His eyes fixed on the axe, on her apron, on the look in her eyes. The truth dawned on him, chasing the fog of alcohol from his mind. "No, no, girl. What have you done?" She started down the stairs, one deliberate step at a time. He scrambled backward. "It is Christmas," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You cannot do this. It is a holy day." She stopped halfway down. "Holiness left this house a long time ago. This is a day of reckoning." Elias turned to run, but slipped on the polished wood at the top of the stairs and tumbled down, landing in a heap at the bottom. His Bible flew from his hands, its pages fluttering as it fell. He lay groaning, trying to quote scripture, but the words were a panicked jumble. He had preached of forgiveness while signing orders for punishment. He had sung hymns while others buried their dead. Now his voice was just noise. She reached the bottom of the stairs, raised the axe, and ended his sermon. 3. 3 down. Only Marcus was left, the loudest, the cruelest. And as if summoned by the thought, a door slammed open on the second floor. A raw, furious scream echoed through the mansion, a sound not of grief, but of pure rage. Thomas had found a body. He was awake, armed, and hunting. Good. Let him come. She gripped the axe. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning.
The house was now breathing with a new, raw energy. It was the kind of energy that rises from settled accounts and answered prayers. Smoke from the dying lamps hung low in the corridors, and the shadows on the walls seemed to have stopped their restless dance. 3 debts had been paid. Jonathan in his study, Julian in his room, Elias at the foot of the stairs. Only one remained, and he was a storm of pure rage. Marcus Beaumont's boots pounded on the floorboards above, each step a promise of violence. He shouted her name, the sound echoing through the empty halls. "Elara, come out, you witch! You think I don't know what you've done?" She heard the metallic click of his pistol being checked. "You hear me? I will find you!" He was hunting. But what he and all the others had never understood was that Elara was not prey. She had not run. She had not hidden. She was waiting. Because Marcus was not an unforeseen obstacle, he was the final signature on a long overdue document. She walked into the grand dining room. The long mahogany table was still set from the feast, a ghost of the celebration that had been. Silver forks and crystal glasses gleamed in the dim light. She walked to the head of the table, the seat her master Arthur had occupied just hours before, and sat down. She placed the axe on the polished wood beside her. The dark stains on its handle were a stark contrast to the gleaming silver. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm. She faced the doorway and waited. It did not take long. Marcus stormed into the room, his eyes wild, his pistol raised. His face was flushed with drink and fury. When he saw her sitting there, so calm and still, his lip curled into a sneer. "There you are. You think this is some kind of game?" She did not answer. "Get up," he commanded. She remained seated. "I said, get up." He took a step forward, his rage escalating at her defiance. In that moment, Elara stood, not in obedience, but to meet him on her feet. The sudden movement was all it took. He fired. The shot was wild, missing her completely and shattering the gilded frame of the Beaumont family portrait on the wall behind her. The image of their father split in two. She did not even flinch. He cursed, fumbling to ready himself for another shot, but it was too late. She crossed the room in 3 long, silent strides. He raised his arm to strike her with the pistol. The axe moved with a precision born not of anger, but of absolute certainty. She screamed, a short, sharp sound that was quickly silenced. He fell, and she followed him to the floor. This time, she said nothing at all. When it was done, the only sound in the vast room was the soft crackle of the dying embers in the hearth. Elara stood in the center of the room, her apron soaked, the axe hanging heavy in her hand. All 4 were gone. The Beaumont name, which had been a force of nature in this county for generations, had been silenced by its own creation. She looked at the abandoned feast, the silver, the crystal, the untouched food, all symbols of a power that had believed itself to be eternal. She picked up a clean glass, poured a small measure of red wine from an open bottle, and sat down again at the head of the table. The blood on her hands was a stark contrast to the delicate crystal stem. She raised the glass not in celebration, but in solemn memory. For Samuel, for Sarah, for her mother, for all the names that had been swallowed by the silence of this house. She drank alone. When the first rays of dawn pierced the tall, arched windows, they found her still sitting there. Her eyes were open, her posture straight. She was not afraid. She was not finished. She was simply free. Not because any law would spare her, for she knew it would not, but because the truth, after a lifetime of being buried, had finally had its say. And in the profound quiet that follows a storm, there was a kind of peace, the kind that is found only in a final, absolute reckoning.
They came for her just after sunrise. A stable hand, sent to investigate the strange silence from the main house, had peered through a window and fled in terror. The sheriff arrived with a half-dozen men, all armed, all with grim faces. When they stepped inside Willow Creek, the silence that greeted them was so heavy it felt like a physical weight. They found the bodies where they lay. Arthur slumped over his ledgers, Julian in his disordered room, Elias at the bottom of the stairs, and Marcus sprawled across the dining room floor. And then they found Elara. She was still at the table, her hands folded, waiting. They shouted questions, but she did not answer. They bound her wrists with coarse rope, tight enough to break the skin, and pulled her from the chair. As they led her down the front steps of the great house, she lifted her face to the morning sky. She looked out over the fields of dormant cotton, the same fields where Samuel had once worked, where generations had toiled and suffered under the Beaumont name. The fields that had absorbed so much pain now seemed to whisper her name on the cold winter wind. Word of the Willow Creek reckoning spread like wildfire. By nightfall, the entire county was buzzing with the story. The official accounts called it the act of a madwoman, a sudden and savage explosion of violence. But the people in the quarters, in the fields, knew better. In hushed tones behind cook fires and in dimly lit cabins, they spoke her name with a mixture of awe and reverence. Her story traveled faster than any written word. The story of the woman who did not run, who did not scream, who met injustice head-on and balanced the scales herself. The trial was brief, its outcome predetermined. No defense was offered, no mercy was considered. The verdict was guilty, the sentence was the gallows. In her cell, Elara was silent. She would sit by the small barred window, a sliver of blue sky visible above. She wasn't praying. She was listening to the names, to the memories, to the faint but growing sound of other chains beginning to loosen. On the day of her execution, they dressed her in plain white cloth. As she walked to the platform, she did not look down. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon. When the sheriff asked if she had any last words, her voice was clear and steady for all to hear. "I only did what they taught me." And then she was silent. But Elara did not truly die that day. Her body was taken, but her story was set free. It traveled down the coast on merchant ships, whispered from one plantation to the next, into the Carolinas, across Alabama, through the swamps of Louisiana. Her name was carved into the bark of ancient trees and woven into the lullabies mothers sang to their children. She became more than a woman. She became a legend, a reminder that even the quietest soul keeps a record of every wrong, that even the most bound hands can find a way to deliver justice, that even the darkest night can end with a reckoning. They tried to bury her name beneath layers of shame and fear, but they did not realize they were only planting a seed, and memory, once planted, grows forever.